The average grunt in the United States Army makes just over $20,000 a year. These are the guys still fresh from basic training, ready for a foreseeable future of serving their country however they are told. In 10 years, they could be a sergeant, making a $44,000 salary, or alternatively, they could be working in the private sector, earning as much as $250,000 a year, more money than United States generals, with 40 years of experience. Viewers who might be interested in this morally grey profession, which is as lucrative as it is dangerous, can get comfortable while we tell you how to become a mercenary, what you'll be doing on the job, and why the occupation even exists in the first place. The first thing to know is that mercenary work is as old as the sword itself. For as long as humans have waged war, there were people who were willing to fight for the highest bidder. Historically, the best part about the job is if your employer refuses to pay, you can just switch sides and steal their shit anyway. In 241 BC, Carthage used 20,000 foreign soldiers to fight their war against Rome. But after a pay dispute, the sellswords would band together and just take a bunch of territory for themselves, leading to a rebellion which would take nearly half a decade to put down. Between the 12th to 14th centuries, free companies of mercenaries began popping up around Europe. Every time a war ended, there were an influx of hardened soldiers with no civilian skills and no monarch to pay them a regular wage, so many would form their own groups and offer their services to whoever could pay their fee. The advantage of a mercenary army is that they are going to be the kind of guys who have both seen combat and been deadly enough to live to brag about their experience. Not only could they charge a hefty fee for their services, but if they couldn't find employment, they could usually just hit smaller settlements until they were paid to fuck off. During the Renaissance, however, the most highly regarded soldiers for hire were Swiss mercenaries. Soon after Switzerland started its famous policy of neutrality, in the early 15th century, its highly regarded pikemen started looking for work outside of its borders, and as it turned out, they were in quite high demand. Supposedly French royalty for a time even considered it impossible to win a battle without Swiss mercenaries making up the core of their armies. However, this sentiment wasn't something we were able to confirm. Fast forward to the golden age of pirates in the 17th century, and nations the world over were wondering how the fuck they could stop their shit from getting plundered at sea. As it turned out, a popular solution was to hand out what was called a letter of marque. What this meant is that pirates, or anyone with a ship full of scallywags, would have a license to legally raid ships from a hostile nation, as long as a small percentage was paid back to the crown. Empires would even pay for captured ships outright, and they acted as expensive prizes in and of themselves. What this meant is that a monarch could stop their ships from getting plundered, while also outsourcing military might to the private sector, essentially for free. The only real problem is that once a war had ended, the letters of marque were invalid, meaning the privateers would just go back to being regular ass pirates. It wasn't until the Cold War when we started seeing mercenaries adopt their modern form, an occupation we now call a private military contractor. The first private military company is believed to have been formed in 1965 by David Sterling and John Woodhouse, two men who would formally found and shape the British SAS. Watchguard International, as the company was called, would first be contracted to do intelligence work in Yemen, but would go on to work all over Africa and the Middle East, organizing weapons deals and training local armies. The company would even be involved in a coup to topple Muammar Gaddafi from power in 1971, but as he would remain the de facto leader for the next 40 years, it's safe to assume that they probably didn't earn their bonus for that job. When the Cold War ended in the 1990s, Western nations began scaling back their defense forces, and this turned out to be a gold rush for private military companies, or PMCs for short. All of a sudden, Western nations were rapidly reducing their personnel, which flooded the market for out-of-work soldiers looking for work. There was also a surplus of military equipment that nations were trying to unload, which led to these companies snatching them up for pennies on the dollar. The third factor is that with the Soviet Union no longer trying to convert nations to communism, like a fucking priest in Age of Empires 2, the United States started pulling out of the third world, leaving many nations with huge gaps to be filled in their defense and security systems. The industry was booming, and in little over 10 years, private contractors would go from being 1 of every 50 military personnel to 1 in every 10. This would go on to be a problem for the special forces community, as nations from all over the world were having their most highly trained fighters poached by these private security firms. In 2005, an estimated 125 troops from the British SAS and SBS left to pursue employment in the private sector, and when considering that both branches combined only consist of between 600 and 850 members at a time, this wasn't an insignificant amount. When looking at the pay grades, this isn't exactly surprising. A junior NCO's wage for one of these British Special Forces was around 2,600 freedom bucks a month, while alternatively, working security for a private military company could net them over 18,000 over the same period of time. On top of this, the work was often easier in the private sector, and security companies could even offer a 1 month on, 1 month off lifestyle. This would eventually become such a huge problem that government agencies such as the US Defense Department offered bonuses of up to $150,000 if they signed on for a 6-year period. Ironically, by far the biggest client for these services was the United States government, and if Uncle Sam thought he could save a few Benjamins by outsourcing military work to the free market, then the American dream would still be alive. Today's video was made possible by Ground News, which is probably the most appropriate sponsor we've ever had. Ground News is the world's first news comparison platform, which allows users to receive the same news stories from a multitude of different sources. As someone who's been covering news for nearly 3 years, I've been consistently astounded with how much the framing of a story can shift the perception of those who read them. Social media algorithms tend to feed a user sources that confirm their own biases. Most news outlets will sensationalize headlines for the easy clicks, and misinformation is a lot more prevalent than most people think. Ground News allows users to compare news stories from different perspectives, monitor the factual and bias ratings from each of these sources, and even track your own reading habits to know how skewed your perception of reality actually is. When looking at abortion in the United States, for example, we can see that a source like Fox News has a right-leaning bias and a mixed factuality rating. However, if we swipe along through some other sources, we'll see that the BBC doesn't lean one way or the other and has earned itself a high standard for factual reporting. This is one of those topics that I would happily talk about for hours, but for viewers who want one of the smartest ways to consume the news, go to groundnews/SirSwag, or simply click on the link in the description like a normal fucking person. Now that we know the brief history of mercenary work, let's talk about how you can start your career path in what a recruiter might call a fast-paced and challenging environment. The first step is to join the military. This might sound counterintuitive, but most private military companies don't do in-house training. After all, it's easier to just let the government spend hundreds of thousands to educate people before yoinking their workforce outright. Quite often, these private companies will be looking to poach people from branches of the special forces, but that doesn't mean you'll need to be the best of the best to get the job. Just knowing how to drive a basic military truck or having skills in IT can be enough for a lot of positions, because not everyone needs to fill for a straight DPS role. PMCs are contracted to do anything from logistics to surveillance, meaning if a military needs something done, the private sector probably does as well. This part in the process is pretty much like university, except instead of getting stuck with a lifetime of debt, they actually pay for everything outside of your monthly RuneScape membership. The next step is to get fit, but if you're in the military for longer than a few months, you've probably cried your muscles into a state of near perfection. Most people pay a small fortune for a personal trainer, but you'll be getting this shit for free. Unlike regular militaries, which are usually stocked by teenagers armed with rocket launchers, most PMCs won't even consider hiring a person under the age of 21, with most private sector soldiers in their mid-30s and early 40s. These are the career guys, who both know their shit, and usually don't fit in with civilian life. After a few years of training, becoming desensitized to violence, and being paid less than a McDonald's worker, you'll now be ready to put your skills to work. After you've got the job, you'll likely be sent to wherever you're needed. This could be domestically protecting a VIP, or traveling halfway round the globe to guard a piece of critical infrastructure. It should be noted that protecting shit will be pretty much your entire job, no matter where you're assigned, as for the most part, a private military contractor isn't allowed to engage an enemy unless they shoot first. This isn't always the case, like for example, when Russian PMC Wagner Group participated in the Ukrainian invasion, but we'll get to the legality of mercenary work soon enough. At this point, a good question you might be asking is why exactly entities like the United States government even bother with private military companies when, as we've previously mentioned, they can simply use their unlimited supply of 19-year-olds who are mostly paid in MRE puddings. One reason is the skill sets. The free market is usually pretty good at finding experts in anything you might need, and if you crank the pay scale high enough, you can almost guarantee an infinite supply of applicants. Another reason is because private companies can be much less rigid with how they operate. Members of the special forces need to be some of the most physically able people on earth, meaning if someone with 15 years of experience becomes no longer eligible to serve, these companies can overlook such ailments. After all, they'd be insane not to hire someone with so much specific experience just because they've developed very minor health issues. Private companies can also hire internationally, meaning if they need to operate in Iraq for example, they can just hire Iraqi professionals directly who are already familiar with the environment, language, and cultural norms. The private sector also has a reputation of efficiency, and when most of the work being outsourced are roles like catering, transport, and logistics, this can also free up room for conventional manpower, should the need arise. Perhaps the most significant benefit, however, is a company's detachment from the government who hired them. What this means is that the United States can hire a PMC to protect certain assets, knowing that no American troops will have boots on the ground. Private military contractors are not listed as military casualties, meaning they can often be given more dangerous tasks. This also comes with a darker side, as entities like the aforementioned Wagner Group, acting as an arm of the Russian military, while also having a degree of plausible deniability when questioned. Wagner Group in particular have been all over the place, taking part in the Sudanese civil war, protecting the illegitimate president of Venezuela after he refused to give up power, guarding strategic chrome mines in Madagascar, and providing military training in Mali. These were the guys who were spearheading the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 alongside regular troops, but they've since operated anywhere that Vladimir Putin has unofficially wanted to influence. Of course, PMCs also come with some very notable downsides. Firstly, the magic and mysterious free market isn't always the most cost-effective or best way to get something done. For example, the private sector is very much influenced by supply and demand, and when the United States is invading a country for example, PMCs can pretty much charge whatever the fuck they want, especially if their services are sorely needed. Stories of price gouging by military suppliers is about as old as the United States itself, with some companies operating with markups of over 9,000%. Another factor to keep in mind is that the free market can only be as flexible as they are allowed. The US military, for example, can set a certain standard around what needs to be achieved, and their budget will reflect what's required to get the job done. A private company, however, can look at the problem at any number of ways, which ideally leads to more innovative and cost-effective methods to achieve the same outcome. The downside, however, is that if contractors are expected to operate under the same standards of the US government, then they are essentially just doing the same job for 10 times the price. With this in mind, it's usually better to have PMC serve specific roles and not have them attempt to replace conventional military functions. Within the same vein, A lack of oversight can also lead to a lower standard among PMCs overall, as a private company could theoretically hire anyone they so choose. This can be a problem when it comes to the skills of each contractor. However, this is most notable if the standard of professionalism isn't met. As we've previously mentioned, the role of what is essentially a gun for hire tends to attract the kind of people who don't function well within civilian life. When this is paired with what is often a severe lack of oversight and years of being desensitized to violence, you can probably guess that this is a recipe for some pretty fucked up incidents. One of the most famous of which took place in 2007 when contractors from US company Blackwater were convicted of killing 17 civilians in Baghdad. This incident would then spiral into a long legal battle, which would eventually see the 4 contractors involved receiving a presidential pardon in December 2020. This also leads into the question of legality. The 1989 United Nations Mercenary Convention technically banned the use of mercenaries. However, pretty much any nation who would have any interest in using mercenaries in the first place simply refused to sign. The main problem is that the line between mercenaries and security guards can often be as blurry as a Japanese adult film, as the only real difference are the kinds of functions being performed. The legal status of a contractor can also become a problem in the unfortunate event they get captured. Under the Geneva Convention, captured soldiers are in theory protected from things like torture or cruel and degrading treatment. Without a flag on their shoulder, a soldier of fortune could just be shit out of luck. Although, with this being said, terror groups usually don't give a fuck about the Geneva Convention anyway. Although perhaps unlikely, there's also the possibility that a PMC's goals might not always be aligned with the interests of its home country. Landing a military contract for the United States is about one of the most stable and lucrative things a company can do, so there's plenty of incentives to stay cozy with Uncle Sam. But this doesn't mean things couldn't change. There's a very real possibility that some of these companies could grow uncomfortably large, and if an army big enough to take over a small nation is only obligated to serve its shareholders, you can probably imagine how dangerous this could become. The discussion around the use of mercenaries is still being debated, such as they have throughout thousands of years of history. Those in favor, usually nations with the intention of using them, argue that they're merely an extension of their military supply network, and that hiring a few private citizens to protect an oil field in the Middle East is no different to contracting a logistics company to supply service members with fresh fruit. Detractors argue that armed force isn't an industry that should be privatized in the first place, as its lack of oversight will and has already led to serious instances of violence and abuse. In the ancient art of war, Sun Tzu once wrote, "There is no instance of a nation benefiting from prolonged warfare." However, for those with the right set of skills and an extreme tolerance for risk, conflict will likely always present an opportunity for serious personal enrichment.